So I wanted to go right back to the beginning. Nicola Baker Bryan is a historian of religion in the ancient world, particularly the Manichaeans, who've lost order of the elect, maintained a vegan diet and they persisted throughout the Middle Ages for around 1,000 years. Now, these asked the questions to Nick or me, or hopefully James Serple, about the whole sweep of vegetarianism. It's the final VidChat, after which I'm going to be close to putting the capstone on the whole project. And I'll be monitoring Twitter and the Google chat that's attached to this keynote. Let's see, just give me the side. And I just wanted to say, please volunteer to you, Nick, please do volunteer any interesting observations when they come up, because I really wanted this to be a free-for-all. Now, I think one question I wanted to ask is when I did the episode that dealt with the early Manichaeans, I ended it with a visit to an Ethiopian food stall. Now, as far as I can tell, the Ethiopian Christianity kind of got established after the age of monasticism, of Middle Eastern monasticism, that I talked to you about. But I wanted to ask you, well, firstly, to sum up that late antiquity monasticism for people who haven't got, well, who might have forgotten what was in the episode, or just or heaven forbid not listen to it yet.
Heaven forbid. Well, no, you're quite right to pick on that period, because it's a period of enormous religious change and quite complex cultural dynamics, where monasticism, scholars are generally very reluctant to put a specific date on the emergence of monasticism, particularly in the form that is most familiar, which is this Egyptian desert monasticism. The 3rd century seems to be a good bet. At some point in the 3rd century, the mid-3rd century perhaps, as Christianity, and we are talking about a specifically Christian phenomenon, began to effectively become more popular and draw in a wide range of people, and develop sort of specific habits and traits with regard to asceticism. So I don't know whether you've spoken much about asceticism yet, but the idea that an individual is completely responsible for the care and duty of their body. And of course, in the ancient world, body and soul were intimately linked. Mental health and physical health were seen to be rooted together in some way, and an imbalance, a humoral imbalance in one or the other could lead to illness. So asceticism begins to develop. It's not a uniquely Christian thing. Greek philosophy, going all the way back to characters like Pythagoras, who I think you spoke about in terms of the origin of the vegetarian strand in Greek philosophy. He was preoccupied with asceticism, or at least his followers were preoccupied with asceticism. So it's quite normal for a religious philosophical movement like Christianity in the 3rd century to also develop an interest in ascetic practices. Coming back to your original question, so the origins of monasticism, well, again, that's a complex issue, but there are effectively 2 types of monasticism that begin to emerge at the end of the 3rd century and into the 4th century. There's a nascent institutionalized monasticism, which is practiced in communities, monasteries, for want of a better expression, although they were called slightly different things then, and also solitary or non-communal monasticism or asceticism. And throughout the 4th century, particularly in Egypt, and certainly in the first half of the 4th century, there is a considerable clash of cultures over the regulation of monastic communities. Now, as we saw in the program, I think the 4th century is also a time when there's an increasing institutionalization of Christianity, brought about by the adoption of Christianity by the ruling Roman elite, most famously in the figure of Constantine. So anything that falls outside of an institutional parameter was generally regarded with a degree of suspicion, and asceticism and monastic practices that weren't under the eyes of the bishop tended to be suspect, or viewed as being suspect.
And that's when Christianity began to clamp down on explicit all through the year vegetarianism.
Yes, that's correct. So, and it's very interesting that the principal measure of an individual or a movement's deviancy from the institutional norm in this period was diet. And the consumption of the exclusive consumption of vegetables came to be seen as a marker of deviancy, which the Christian Church, of course, used the term heresy as the catch-all term for deviant, aberrant Christians. So whether or not it was justified, heretical Christians tended to be vegetarians. Now, vegetarian in itself, within the context of Christianity, is a strange one to read. Certainly, there had been vegetarian Christian movements in the 2nd century. There's a group called the Ebionites that I think you may have mentioned in one of your programs. Again, eventually branded with the stick of being heretical. But in the 4th century, this process becomes magnified and accelerated, and diet becomes a key, a kind of hermeneutic to understanding the validity and the orthodoxy of a Christian movement. I don't know whether that answers that background question.
It does look at how that relates, and broadly speaking, there's a vegetarian strand within asceticism, but it slightly gets pushed into, well, only part of the year in the context of ordered Christianity. And I suppose my question was more about the link between that, broader than Christianity, Middle Eastern monasticism, because I tend to think of, certainly in the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, I tend to think of these various monks and nuns who are eating very simple foods, maybe just grain and water, actually behaving like that across a mix of theologies, whether the Jewish Theophrasti or all the Essenes, the Gnostics, of course, and of course the Manichaeans, whether the Neoplaton and the pagan Neoplatonists, that I was tending to see that as one movement in a way.
No, I think that's quite correct, and I think, of course, they aren't these movements or these sects are free to regulate themselves in the early period, because particularly if they're aligned with Christianity, because Christianity as a religion was illegal within the Roman Empire, so they tended to mind their own business and be very secretive in what they did. You're quite right in suggesting, though, that there is a the use of the term movement is interesting, because I think that suggests a unification of practice, which perhaps wasn't there. However, that's not to say that there wasn't something, in the air, so to speak, or in the water, which was determining a greater awareness of the need for ethical vegetarianism, I guess you could call it. I mean, it's present even in extremely high-profile classical authors like Ovid, for example. The end of the Metamorphoses, which is this epic poetical work by a Roman poet called Ovid. We find a kind of a plea for vegetarian practice, configured as a kind of ethical, as an important ethical maxim for the way to conduct a responsible life. I think you may have disappeared.